Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into a world that's brutal, beautiful, and utterly unrelenting. The Roman Empire. Before we begin, if you find these sleepy history stories relaxing, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always comforting to know we're not alone, even in the quiet. So now, dim the lights, settle in, maybe turn on a little background fan for that soft hum, and let's drift into a colder, harsher world, not of kings and knights, but of the ones who just tried to stay warm. Winter wasn't a season, it was a test of survival. So before we step into the shadows of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if this kind of raw, immersive storytelling is your thing. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story reaches. Initially, she assumed the expected role of maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, moving gracefully within the Queen's shadow. Yet even there, Anne's presence blazed like a candle too bright and stubborn to be extinguished. She danced with effortless elegance, spoke fluent French as if born to the tongue, and laughed with a confidence that startled and delighted. Her vivacity caught the attention of men and stirred the whispers of women, setting the wheels of court intrigue into motion. Initially, she assumed the expected role of maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, moving gracefully within the Queen's shadow. Yet even there, Anne's presence blazed like a candle too bright and stubborn to be extinguished. She danced with effortless elegance, spoke fluent French as if born to the tongue, and laughed with a confidence that startled and delighted. Her vivacity caught the attention of men and stirred the whispers of women, setting the wheels of court intrigue into motion. She did not conform to the classical ideals of beauty. Even her admirers acknowledged that she was no flawless blonde maiden, yet there was something undeniably arresting about her. Dark eyes, flickering with intelligence and mischief, a clear, melodic voice that carried both charm and authority, and a purposeful grace in her every movement that hinted at strength, barely restrained beneath layers of courtly poise. Anne did not simply enter a room, she shifted its atmosphere, becoming its center of gravity. In an era when a woman's destiny was often narrowly dictated by birth and marriage, Anne refused to drift passively into obscurity or submission. She had witnessed firsthand the extraordinary power that a combination of charm, intellect, and political savvy could wield in the courts of Europe, and she was determined to wield that power back home, within the tumultuous sphere of Tudor England. Still young, still untested, Anne Boleyn returned not just as the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, but as a formidable player in a far greater game, one that would soon envelop the throne itself. Upon her arrival at the English court, she was unlike any noblewoman the realm had seen before. Among the sea of pale-faced, demure English ladies, Anne was a tempest, electric, unpredictable, and impossible to overlook. Her dark hair framed a face alive with fiery intelligence, her eyes bold and unwavering, her wit sharp and quick. Yet from these humble origins an extraordinary force was quietly taking root, a life destined to one day shift the very currents of English history. From the earliest days of her childhood, Anne was distinguished not by inherited wealth or noble rank, but by the sharpness of her intellect and the fire of her spirit. She was clever, vivacious, and undeniably magnetic, qualities that did not go unnoticed by her family. Recognizing her rare potential, they arranged for her to be educated abroad on the European continent, where her true formation would begin. Her first significant post was in the dazzling court of the Netherlands, where she served Margaret of Austria, the formidable regent and aunt to Emperor Charles V. Few English girls could have imagined such a position, and yet Anne thrived in this glittering world of diplomacy and refinement. There she absorbed the intricate art of political maneuvering, polished her manners to a fine sheen, and learned the delicate choreography of European court life, where a glance, a word, or a gesture could alter alliances and fortunes. But it was in France where Anne's natural brilliance truly blossomed. For years, she moved among the elegant courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, soaking in the sophisticated culture of Renaissance France. Here, Anne mastered more than languages. She learned the subtleties of influence, the power of elegance, and the nuanced dance of flirtation and wit. While her contemporaries spent hours perfecting embroidery and needlework, Anne sharpened her conversational skills, honed her ability to navigate intrigue, and discovered how to command a room without seeming to strive for attention. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne Boleyn was something exceptionally rare. A woman who could match the polish and sophistication of the most cultured continental courtiers, yet carried within her the fierce ambition of a rising English noble house. The foundations of their communities rested on far more than mere shared territory. These were bonds forged in the furnace of collective survival, where every life was intertwined with the lives of others. They educated one another on how to care for the ailing, how to combine scarce provisions when food supplies dwindled, and above all, how to place trust in the simple yet profound truth that offering aid to a neighbour shivering in the cold today might ensure someone extends a helping hand to you come tomorrow. Their entire way of life revolved around this unshakable conviction. No one, no matter how strong or stubborn, could triumph over the merciless winter alone. Faith, too, was woven tightly into their endurance. It wasn't a distant ritual confined to Sundays, it was an unrelenting thread running through each frozen breath and every twilight prayer. Piece by frostbitten piece, these resilient souls propelled humanity forward. They withstood winters so severe their ancestors could barely endure them, laying the groundwork for a world where warmth and comfort eventually became everyday realities instead of unreachable dreams. Their sweat, blood, and relentless ingenuity are invisibly woven into the fabric of our modern existence. Every snug blanket wrapped around tired shoulders, every hearth crackling in a cozy home, every quiet evening spent sipping tea beneath the gentle glow of lamps owes its existence to the countless medieval peasants who refused to succumb to the cold. So the next time the wind rattles your double-paned window or snow piles silently outside your door, take a moment to remember them. The anonymous, courageous souls who transformed sheer survival against the bitter cold into a legacy that still warms us today. One glowing ember, one fragile breath, one stubborn heartbeat after another. Anne Boleyn did not enter the world bearing a crown or commanding armies at her disposal. Born around the year 1501, likely within the walls of Blickling Hall or Heacham Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a driven and ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with far-reaching and influential family connections. Within the intricate and hierarchical tapestry of Tudor society, Anne's arrival barely caused a ripple, an almost unnoticed event amid the grand machinations of power and politics. They whispered prayers into the chill of the night, not merely from terror or desperation, but from a fragile, defiant hope. A hope that the coming dawn might bring a touch of warmth, a sliver of light. They dared to believe that, after enduring countless dark and bitterly cold nights, spring would return, breaking through the hardened, frozen earth and breathing life anew. Miraculously, it always did. Because of their sacrifice, because of those uncelebrated triumphs, clinging to life through one more night, one more merciless storm, future generations were given the chance to flourish. But beneath the surface of their suffering lies something far more profound, a legacy of raw, unyielding ingenuity and indomitable endurance. They had no central heating, no thermal gear, no plush mattresses to keep them warm. They didn't even have the luxury of expecting to survive each winter. What they did have, and what they left us, was the blueprint of resilience. Every mattress stuffed with hay, every carefully banked fire, every moss-crammed gap in a wall, stood as a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with brutal, often impossible odds, they refused to break. They adapted. They learned from the harsh land, from each other, and from the brutal lessons etched into every frozen, relentless winter night. Medieval homes themselves were fragile shelters against the brutal elements. Heavy snow could pile relentlessly atop roofs, while fierce ice storms battered wooden beams and thatched coverings. When a roof finally gave way on a freezing night, it wasn't just a disaster, it was a death trap. Forced out into the night, villagers had to trudge through snow that often reached waist or thigh height, seeking refuge from neighbours. But increasingly with the help of salvation, especially when those neighbours were already stretched to their absolute limits, barely able to care for their own. The harsh reality was clear. Winter was a merciless predator, and survival hinged on the smallest things, keeping embers alive, shelter intact, and hope burning as fiercely as the fire in the hearth. Would you like me to continue with more about how communities adapted, or explore individual stories of resilience? Death wasn't a shocking visitor, but a familiar neighbour knocking at the door, wrapped in ice and waiting its turn patiently. Yet despite the bitter cold and ceaseless threat, medieval peasants pressed forward, stubborn, grieving, and fiercely clinging to life. Because as long as one ember glowed in the hearth and one breath lingered in the frozen air, the fight was not over. When we look back on these muddy, frost-bitten survivors of unending winters, it's tempting to focus only on their hardships. Cracked, weather-beaten hands, frost-bitten toes, and smoke-choked huts. Disease thrived in the cold just as relentlessly as the frost. Starvation sapped strength from weary bodies, leaving villagers vulnerable, while cramped, smoky huts became breeding grounds for deadly illnesses, pneumonia, bronchitis, and countless infections that could turn a mere winter cough into a death sentence by January. Then there was the silent, creeping terror of frostbite, fingers, toes, even ears blackening, dying while still attached to their owners. Many villagers survived harsh winters only by sacrificing parts of themselves. These frostbitten limbs became grim badges of honor, proof that they had endured another merciless season, even if winter claimed a piece of them in the process. What's most haunting, however, isn't only the staggering death toll, it's the eerie normalcy of it all. Each year, villagers accepted that some among them simply wouldn't see spring. Yet, despite all their grit, resourcefulness, and prayers, winter could be an unforgiving foe. When it claimed victory, it didn't just snatch a few unlucky souls, it swallowed entire families, whole villages, erasing them beneath crushing blankets of snow and ice. Some winters were merciless beyond imagination. Take the infamous Great Famine Winter of 1315, a grim chapter where relentless rains drowned the fields, starving livestock wandered hollow-eyed, and freezing temperatures turned survival into a torturous grind. Hunger gnawed so fiercely that desperate whispers spoke of chewing on worn shoe leather, stripping bark from trees, and in the darkest corners, horrifying tales of cannibalism. Failing to keep the fire burning wasn't just a minor setback, it was often a direct sentence to death. Without the hearth's faint, struggling warmth, families would cling to one another in a final, desperate embrace. Come spring, neighbours might discover entire households frozen solid, bodies intertwined, as if holding on to whatever flicker of heat remained between them, sharing warmth in death as they couldn't in life. And no serious winter prayer was complete without a few heartfelt promises. Bargains whispered into the smoky air. "Dear Lord, if you'll just see us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbour, even the one who keeps sneaking off with our turnips." It wasn't about asking for riches or ease, just the barest thread of survival, a spark of warmth, a morsel of food, and one more dawn to hold on to before the relentless freeze finally broke with spring's arrival. Faith wasn't an abstract comfort, it was an urgent, daily conversation with the divine. The peasants didn't pray for grandeur, they prayed for endurance. Raw, simple hope breathed quietly into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers and tucked tightly beneath scratchy blankets. It was that fragile faith, more than anything else, that carried them through the endless, merciless nights. Superstitions wrapped snugly around daily survival like extra layers of clothing. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth before settling in for the night, hoping to keep malevolent spirits and, at the very least, those irritating, chilling drafts at bay. Others took up the ancient practice of marking their doorways with blessed chalk, after feast days, inscribing sacred symbols as quiet pleas for warmth, protection, and good fortune to slip inside alongside them. Candles, too, played their part, flickering beacons against the darkness, their soft glow carrying both light and hope into the long, cold nights. Special vigil candles, carefully blessed by the village priest or the most devout old woman known for her unwavering faith, were often left burning throughout the long, bitter nights. Their tiny flames flickered like fragile sentinels, a desperate plea against the encroaching darkness, clawing at the rough wooden walls. These candles weren't just light, they were beacons of hope, spiritual armor against the cold's merciless grasp. Saints weren't distant, untouchable icons in gilded frames. No, in the grip of winter's brutal siege, they became vital frontline warriors. Take Saint Same, for example, invoked fiercely to guard against the dreaded throat ailments that could choke the life from even the strongest peasant. A mere gulp of biting icy air could send you into fits of coughing that felt like your soul was being wrenched from your chest. St. Nicholas, too, was far more than a merry, gift-bearing figure of later stories. He was called upon to shield homes from sudden misfortune, especially during those merciless months when food ran scarce and desperation ran high. Faith wasn't just a once-a-week ritual back then, it was stitched into every laboured, frost-bitten breath. Before slipping beneath heavy layers of straw and the relentless itch of coarse wool, families would gather close, knees pressed to the cold, hard floor, voices hushed but urgent as they offered up quick prayers. Prayers to keep the fires flicker alive through the endless night, to hold the fragile roof from leaking or collapsing under snow's crushing weight, and to miraculously keep their toes from freezing stiff by dawn. In the frozen heart of winter, the village transformed into one large, unruly family, sometimes dysfunctional, often raucously entertaining, but always fiercely united in a stubborn refusal to succumb to the cold. One muddy boot at a time, one crackling ember, one frost-nipped smile after another, they faced the merciless chill together. But it wasn't just human ingenuity and grit. When the wind shrieked outside and the fire dwindled to glowing coals, medieval peasants prayed a lot. Because when your walls are little more than paper-thin hopes and your breath freezes mid-air, every ounce of warmth counted, and that included whatever divine intervention you could summon. In that desperate, cold struggle for life, faith was as essential as cloaks, fires, or piled hay. They were the medieval neighborhood watch, minus the neon vests, but definitely with a lot more sheep wandering around. When a family's fire went out, it was nothing short of a near crisis. A good neighbor didn't hesitate, whether it meant rushing over with a glowing coal swaddled in rags or, better yet, shoving a few extra bodies into their already cramped smoky hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing 4 more souls shoulder to shoulder, trading space for warmth. But it was far preferable to discovering frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores were another crucial lifeline. In particularly savage winters, villages scraped the bottom of their pantries, pulling out the last of the salted pork, the hard grains, and the brittle dried vegetables. It was grim charity, meagre portions doled out from shared reserves, but those meagre communal meals often spelled the difference between staggering into spring or never staggering at all. Even children, those small bundles of restless energy, understood the stakes. They hauled firewood, ferried glowing embers, and dashed urgent messages between homes when a neighbour's situation grew desperate. No one was too small, too weak, or too exhausted once winter had settled in for the long haul. Of course, medieval villages weren't endless scenes of harmony. Feuds and quarrels over land boundaries, goats, or who'd borrowed whose prized cooking pot without returning it, lingered stubbornly year-round. But when the nights became bone-chillingly cold and the wind howled like a pack of starving wolves outside fragile wolves, old grudges were quietly put on hold. Because, when all was said and done, every soul alive was worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you who needed the rescue. In the harsh, unforgiving medieval world, no one survived winter in isolation, unless they fancied the idea of turning into a very stylish, albeit very frozen, statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family matter, it was an entire village's relentless, mudded, and often chaotic project. It was a cacophonous collaboration where every ember of warmth and every pulse of life depended on the next person's. The peasants knew well enough that when the dead of winter tightened its icy grip, even the strongest fire and the thickest pile of hay could only stave off the cold for so long. If your neighbour's hearth went dark, it wasn't just an odd sight, it was a glaring red flag. If the familiar tendrils of smoke from old Tom's chimney suddenly stopped spiralling into the grey sky, it sparked concern. And no, it wasn't just because Tom might owe you a chicken or two, though, sure, that was always in the back of your mind. It was because community, in the bitter grip of winter, equaled survival. Villages had their own unofficial winter watchers, often the young too weak for field labour, or the elderly too weathered for heavy work, yet sharp-eyed enough to spot trouble. These stalwart sentinels noted who was hacking up too much, who had missed the market barter for days, or whose windows stared blankly into the frost-bitten dawn. If fortune smiled upon you, you'd fall asleep facing the fire, basking in its comforting glow on one side, while the other side lay frozen solid enough to tap like a block of ice. The animals of the household were part of this nightly chaos too. Dogs, those lovable heat hoggers, often wedged themselves between you and the fire, their tails wagging dangerously close to the open flame. Chickens, ever bold, sometimes roosted precariously on the hearthstones, their soft clucking filling the night air like feathery little sentinels guarding the warmth. Every crackle of burning wood, every flicker and pop of glowing embers was a quiet, vital promise. You're still alive. You're still holding on to warmth. For now. And so the peasants surrendered to uneasy slumber, rocked by the fire's rhythm of pops and hisses, each breath escaping in tiny clouds into the bitter night beyond the fragile circle of heat. It was far from perfect. It was rough, uncomfortable, and unpredictable, but it was life itself, clinging by a fragile thread of glowing coals against the merciless grip of winter. It was simple, unforgiving survival math. Babies were fragile little heat sources, their tiny bodies unable to generate much warmth but in desperate need of protection. Elders, on the other hand, were treasured living libraries of family lore, and, let's be honest, the kingdom's best gossip hubs. Wrapping them in the best warmth available wasn't a luxury, it was an unbreakable rule written by necessity. But don't imagine it was all gentle, crackling fires and cosy warmth. No, the fire was a tricky beast to live alongside. Too close and you risked waking up with singed hair, a cloak suspiciously smoky, or even the terrifying smell of something burning that wasn't dinner. Too far away and you might as well have been camping in a frozen cave. It was a precarious balancing act, a delicate waltz of survival. Stay close enough to soak in the fire's flickering glow, but not so close that you needed to explain to your neighbour why you now resembled a half-roasted spit. The hearth's heat wasn't a gentle blanket, it was a harsh spotlight. The flames primarily roasted whoever sat or slept directly in front of them, while everyone else scuffled and scrambled for the narrow cone of warmth like frost-bitten lizards vying for the smallest patch of sun on a cold rock. The most vulnerable, the infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail, claimed the prime spots near the hearth first, their bodies shielded by the precious warmth. Parents, older children, and the hardier adults layered themselves outward, creating a human chain of insulation that fought back the relentless cold. Being assigned a place near the fire was more than a kindness. It was a lifeline, a silent acknowledgement of your place in the pecking order of survival. In the grand toolkit of medieval winter survival, a glowing stone hidden in a bed of straw might not sound glamorous, but for peasants desperately clutching at every scrap of heat, it was nothing short of a tiny miracle. Inside a medieval peasant's home, the hearth was far more than just a place to cook the evening's meagre meal. It was practically a living, breathing family member. Temperamental and smoky, stubborn and unpredictable, yes, but utterly indispensable, especially when night fell and the temperature plunged. The closer you were to the fire, the better your chances of greeting the morning without frostbitten fingers or toes. That meant sleeping arrangements weren't about comfort or personal preference, they were all about tactical survival. Well, winter injuries in those days were about more than just slipping on ice or frostbite. Imagine the screams, But when all went according to plan, that humble rock bestowed hours of precious, life-saving warmth, transforming a freezing night from near torture into something barely bearable. It wasn't plush or pampering, but in a world where your hut's walls rattled with icy drafts and your breath frosted in the air, luxury was simply not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. After roasting the stone until it was almost too hot to handle, a delicate balance between comforting warmth and a potential third-degree burn, the lucky or unlucky family member would fish it out of the fire using a crude stick or some battered iron tongs. The stone, still radiating soothing heat like a tiny sun, was then carefully swaddled in scraps of cloth, wrapped snugly in an old threadbare rag, or nestled inside a cracked clay pot to tame its fierceness. From there, it was discreetly slipped beneath the hay-stuff mattress or jammed in at the foot of the bed, a medieval heating pad primed to wage war against the bone-chilling cold seeping up from the frozen ground. Of course, this ancient form of warmth came with its own set of hazards. Forget to wrap that stone properly, and congratulations, you just hosted a small but terrifying house fire. Drop it on your foot. Long before the invention of electric blankets or heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to rely on creativity and resourcefulness to steal a little extra warmth once the sun dipped below the horizon. Enter two unsung heroes of winter comfort, the humble haybox and the surprisingly glamorous heated stone. First, the haybox. It might sound rustic, and, well, it absolutely was, but its brilliance was undeniable. Peasants took a sturdy wooden box and lined it thickly with hay, transforming it into a clever thermal container. This ingenious contraption was used to keep cooked food piping hot for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge. Just tuck the pot inside the haybox, cover it up, and voila! Warm food ready for a late-night bite without the hassle or danger of stoking a dying fire. Think of it as the medieval slow cooker, long before modern appliances made cooking effortless, but the haybox was only the beginning. The peasants quickly realized that if hay could trap the lingering heat from a stew pot, it could also insulate something even better: stones. Fatty foods held a special place in the medieval peasants' winter survival toolkit. Not just for their rich energy content, but because fat burned much slower than lean meat, offering a prolonged internal warmth. Imagine a belly stuffed with thick, hearty stew, dense rye bread, and a generous, if somewhat questionable, dollop of lard. The pinnacle of medieval winter luxury. Parents weren't about to let even the fussiest little ones skip their supper. If young Thomas hated turnips, tough luck. You ate the turnips, or you shivered miserably all night, silently regretting every missed bite. It was a harsh, no-nonsense parenting style, medieval edition. Of course, consuming a heavy meal before bed wasn't without its own set of risks. Sure, you'd be warmer, but you also ran the risk of wrestling with a night full of strange, vivid dreams, a side effect of your stomach desperately trying to break down what felt like an entire Cabbage Patch's harvest. Was it worth it? Absolutely. This gave birth to the era of the heated stone, a simple yet effective nighttime warming device. Just before bedtime, the unfortunate family member who lost the argument, usually a poor child, would grab a flat, smooth stone and toss it right into the glowing heart of the hearth fire. The goal wasn't a Michelin star-worthy dinner, but pure, unadulterated survival. If that meant going to bed bloated, half asleep with slow, careful breathing next to a gently steaming cow, then so be it. Just another night in the brutal but determined quest to greet another frosty dawn. In the relentless, unforgiving war against the biting chill of medieval winters, peasants stumbled upon a surprisingly effective secret weapon. A full, satisfied stomach. That's right. Fighting frostbite wasn't just about wrapping yourself in another coarse, scratchy woolen cloak or piling on patchy blankets. The real game changer? Eating a hearty, calorie-packed meal right before crawling into bed. Because in the cold medieval world, calories weren't just fuel for the body, they were a critical source of internal warmth. It's basic medieval thermodynamics at work. Consume a dense, heavy meal, and your body kicks into overdrive, working hard to digest all that food, generating precious heat from within. This internal furnace was the difference between surviving a frigid night or becoming a frozen peasant-shaped popsicle by dawn. So, what did these hardy souls heap onto their plates before facing the long, cold hours? Picture thick, rich stews simmering over smoky hearths, brimming with root vegetables like hearty turnips, pungent onions and sweet parsnips, all slow-cooked into a nourishing, warming mess. Grains were a life-sustaining staple as well: creamy oat porridge, nutty barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread that could fill the belly and stave off hunger for hours. And if fortune smiled upon you, perhaps after a festival feast or a bountiful slaughter, you might get the rare luxury of a chunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage tossed into the pot, adding a burst of rich flavour and even more fuel for the body's internal furnace. This wasn't Instagram-worthy comfort food with perfect plating and fancy hashtags. No, it was gritty, practical sustenance designed to keep the cold at bay and the fire burning inside the body long after the hearth had died down. It was a survival technique, stripped down to its bare essentials, forged in the crucible of freezing nights and biting winds. This wasn't the flashiest or most glamorous survival tactic in the medieval survival handbook, but it was incredibly effective. Piece by piece, breath by breath, these hardy peasants endured, pushing through yet another merciless night in the ongoing, relentless battle against winter's unforgiving grip. One shallow breath at a time, they clung to life, fueled by stubborn determination and the primal instinct to survive. And honestly, between the rigorous breathing drills, the constant itch of coarse woolen layers, and the challenge of sharing a bed with an aggressively gassy goat, surviving childhood winters in the medieval world was a whole different level of character forging. Nights were spent nestled deep in piles of straw, swaddled beneath heavy, threadbare cloaks, and crammed next to a gently steaming cowl that provided just enough warmth to keep the biting cold at bay. In that frozen rustic world, breathing wasn't just natural, it became a practiced skill, a carefully honed art. Every inhale had to be slow, deliberate, and through the nose only, shallow enough to minimize exposure to the frosty night air, yet steady enough to keep life moving forward. Imagine a grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, except instead of peace and tranquility, you got frostbite and relentless hardship, with zero inspirational mantras to soothe your aching bones. The glowing embers endured through the long, frigid nights, and with them, the survival of the entire family. So, next time you find yourself grumbling about having to wake up in the middle of the night just to adjust your thermostat or let your cat outside, pause and imagine a medieval peasant squinting through the smoke of a flickering fire at 3 a.m., silently questioning whether preserving their frozen toes was really worth the endless effort. Because when winter's icy grip tightens that hard, you know survival means controlling even the most basic of instincts, like how you breathe, just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't merely combat the relentless, bone-chilling cold with thick layers of worn cloaks, sputtering hearth fires, or their rugged makeshift bedding. No, they took survival to a whole other level by altering their very breath throughout the freezing night. The danger was simple yet deadly. Taking deep, open-mouthed breaths sucked frigid, biting air straight into their vulnerable lungs. And, in an era when a simple illness like pneumonia could swiftly claim a life faster than you could whisper a desperate Hail Mary, this was a risk nobody was willing to gamble with. And through sheer grit, stubborn determination, and a profound knowledge of their environment, medieval peasants survived the bitter winters, not just by fighting the cold outside, but by mastering every detail of their existence, from stuffing cracks with whatever insulating material they could find, to adjusting their breath in the dead of night. So next time you feel the chill and grumble about a draft or a sudden wake-up call, spare a thought for those who faced winters where every breath was a battle, every ember a lifeline, and every frozen toe a reminder that survival was the greatest victory of all. Instead, they mastered the art of shallow, controlled breathing, a subconscious defense against the harsh winter air invading their bodies. This wasn't just an act of willpower, it was a vital, life-preserving technique born from centuries of hardship and harsh winters that showed no mercy. Every breath had to be carefully measured, every inhale calculated, just to avoid the chilling sickness that lurked in every cold draught. So, while we enjoy the luxury of modern heating and cozy beds, it's worth remembering the gritty reality of those medieval nights. Nights spent huddled close to fragile fires, surrounded by the constant crackle of dying embers and the whispering cold seeping through every crack and crevice of their humble homes. Those embers were more than just warmth. They were the fragile line between life and death, hope and despair, just aching joints, drooping eyelids, and a steadily mounting irritation aimed at whoever snored the loudest during your miserable watch. Even children old enough to grip a stick were drafted into the effort, quickly learning that in the merciless grip of winter, everyone had to carry their share of the burden, or risk freezing to death. Elderly family members often lingered by the fire longer than most, partly because their wisdom made them valuable guardians of warmth, and partly because arthritis turned the simple act of lying down and rising again into a daunting ordeal. When your turn finally came to rest, don't count on peace and quiet. People shuffled around, animals stirred in the shadows, wind howled and thrashed against the fragile walls, and every now and then a sibling would inadvertently give you a sharp shove in the night from a heavy roll. Getting a solid stretch of uninterrupted sleep was nothing short of a miracle. Yet somehow, despite the relentless fatigue, the system held together. Taking turns sleeping meant there was always a watchful pair of eyes and cold, reluctant hands nearby, ready to stoke the fire and fend off the creeping chill. You drift off for a few hours, only to be roughly nudged awake with a sharp elbow, then shuffled, bleary-eyed and grumbling, over to the hearth to poke, prod, and swear under your breath as you coax the fire back to life, all while trying not to stumble over the family goat curled up nearby. This rotation was far from glamorous. There were no night vision goggles to guide your way, no midnight snacks to brighten the gloom, and absolutely no snooze buttons offering just 5 more minutes. It was raw survival, fueled by stubbornness, cold toes, and the faint hope that the fire would hold through until dawn. The reality was far more basic, and a good deal more desperate. Half the household remained awake through the long, freezing night, tending the stubborn fire and sealing any sneaky drafts that dared to creep in, while the other half curled up beneath threadbare blankets and piles of hay, clutching at whatever fleeting moments of half-frozen rest they could snatch. The fire demanded constant vigilance. Left unattended, its glow would fade, and reigniting those stubborn embers was about as easy as convincing a mule to dance ballet. So, someone always had to be on what you might call ember watch. But once a person finally managed to get warm, even if just barely, they didn't want to move a muscle. That's why families devised a rotating system. When the cold dug deep enough to rob you of sleep, peasants had a cunning workaround. They abandoned the fantasy that everyone could sleep soundly through the night. Instead, they developed a survival tactic that would impress even the most disciplined modern military strategist: sleeping in shifts. This wasn't some formal system with bugle calls or schedules, but an instinctive, practical routine born from necessity. As one group huddled in restless slumber, the others kept watch, warding off the cold and any unwelcome visitors, making sure that someone was always alert enough to seal a sudden draft or shoo away an inquisitive animal. Each night turned into a relentless contest between human cleverness and the persistent, stealthy chill that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. One moment you'd be cozy and warm, wrapped in whatever meagre layers you could muster, and the next, a sudden icy draft would sneak in like a ghostly hand, jolting you awake with a sharp slap of frosty dew. Yet, fueled by grit, resourcefulness, and an unyielding refusal to accept the freezing cold as an unavoidable fate, medieval peasants battled through the harshest winters nature dared to unleash, patching holes, stuffing gaps, and slathering mud with determined hands, all one muddy handful at a time. Eventually, every humble dwelling began to resemble a weary patchwork quilt, stitched together by a tired hand that gave up halfway through the task. Doors and windows, if you were fortunate enough to have them at all, were more a symbol of hope than comfort. Those rare doors were little more than roughly hewn wooden planks, crudely fastened together with rusty iron nails, and held in place by nothing but sheer grit and determination. The windows were often just holes in the walls, crudely covered with stretched animal hides or heavy, coarse fabric soaked in greasy animal fat. This improvised ceiling not only fought off the biting drafts, but also infused the entire living space with a pungent, lingering scent of mystery meat, an aroma that was as much a part of medieval life as the chill in the air. To combat this, peasants resorted to patching their roofs with whatever scraps they could scavenge. Bits of worn-out cloth, tightly bound bundles of reeds, and in the direst moments, chunks of turf ripped from the surrounding fields. This patchwork defense was far from perfect, often requiring repeated attention, especially when the harsh winter rains arrived. Each time the water leaked through, it meant more patching, more stuffing, more labour. Yet, despite the discomfort and endless maintenance, these makeshift repairs were a testament to the peasants' resilience, a crude form of home insulation born out of necessity and stubborn hope. So next time you enjoy a warm, dry house, spare a thought for those who braved cold winds and soaked roofs with nothing but scraps, mud, and grit. Imagine yourself standing out in the bitter cold, hands numb as you smear icy, pungent manure onto the walls of your humble home, all while whispering to yourself, "This is perfectly fine. This is what luxury feels like." It sounds absurd, but in many ways it was the harsh reality of medieval living. Roof leaks were a relentless enemy to peasants, a daily annoyance that tested their patience and resourcefulness. The thatch roofs, although cheap and readily available, were far from watertight. After enduring countless storms, drizzles, and heavy snowfalls, the once snug roof would develop holes and weak spots that let the cold, wet elements creep inside. So, next time you nestle into your plush, supportive mattress, remember that somewhere in history, a medieval peasant is watching you with a crooked grin, teeth missing and all, thinking, "Must be nice." Living in a hut made of sticks, mud, and pure hope, you quickly realize that winter drafts aren't just annoying. They're personal assaults. Medieval peasants didn't only battle the cold outside, they fought it inside their homes too, armed with whatever scraps they could stuff into every crack and crevice. And believe me, there were plenty of cracks. Walls twisted, mud crumbled, and thatch sagged. The cold seemed to invent new ways to sneak inside each night, like a mischievous ghost bent on revenge. Sealing up the home became a skillful craft. Peasants packed every crevice with moss, straw, tattered scraps of fabric, bundles of dried grass, and occasionally even animal fur. If it was soft, pliable, or offered any kind of insulation, it was forced into some crack or gap. Some especially resourceful individuals slathered additional layers of mud and dung over the exterior walls as a yearly winter ritual. These straw mattresses were more than just uncomfortable, they were also short-lived. Over time, the straw would compress, become damp and mouldy, attract creepy crawlies, and basically transform into a hazardous breeding ground. Replacing the straw was a major chore, typically tackled a few times annually if you were conscientious, or whenever your bed started shifting on its own, much to your dismay. Rushes were a common substitute. These long, fibrous grasses were laid down generously on the floor, occasionally combined with fragrant herbs such as lavender or rosemary to cover up the persistent stench of barnyard life. Fresh rushes gave off a pleasant scent for maybe a day. Afterward, they melded into the muddy, trampled mess inside the home, merging with soil, leftover food bits, and whatever else found its way indoors. And of course, we can't overlook the unwelcome roommates. Fleas, lice, and other delightful pests adored straw mattresses almost as much as the peasants themselves did. If you woke up scratching more than resting, congratulations, you were truly immersed in the genuine medieval lifestyle. Despite all the discomfort, these simple beds were lifesavers. Mounds of straw offered an essential insulating barrier against the icy ground beneath, and when peasants huddled together on top, their combined body heat created warm pockets, medieval central heating at its absolute best. In the medieval peasant realm, beds were typically crude wooden frames, if you were lucky enough to have one, topped with a large sack filled with straw, hay, or dried rushes. That was the whole setup. No memory foam cushions, no orthopedic padding, no luxury hotel comfort. Just a rough, uneven, poky heap that carried a faint scent of barnyard and lingering disappointment. Each restless twist and turn during the night was accompanied by the charming rustle of crunching straw and the occasional prick from a stray stalk. Some peasants bypassed the wooden frame entirely, spreading the straw directly on the bare dirt floor, crafting a rustic sleeping arrangement that today's wellness influencers might hype as earth-connected rest or grounded slumber. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It served its purpose, and if by February you had developed a dense, oily outer coating, congratulations, you were truly thriving. If you imagine medieval peasants spending their cold winters nestled in luxurious feather mattresses with ornate sticked blankets, think twice. The truth was far more rough and simple. By rough and simple, I mean they slept on heaps of dried vegetation, praying for warmth and survival. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic story of that one time you slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outsiders, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-restraint. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. So next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags, and counted themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something to scrub off. It was practically a survival tool. Turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say genius. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from scraps of leather or fabric, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style and elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. If the cold still bit through, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. Forget about washing all these layers. Washing clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, breaking through the ice, and then waiting days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle, most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, a basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt, Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prized trophy. Congratulations, you're now about 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trend. They layered up like soldiers preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, often right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock came with its hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings were full of surprises. So, next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, remember, at least you're not jostling for elbow room between a snoring uncle and a highly judgmental goat. If you think modern roommates are tough, medieval peasants would love to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat were brought indoors. This wasn't just some quirky village tradition, it was a matter of survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach growling, every degree of heat counted. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was less likely to get stolen by a sneaky neighbour under the cover of darkness. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the house transformed into a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged comfortably against the walls, chewing cud as if they were paying rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. Imagine being stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower. Now replace that person with a cow. It's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells, legendary. By springtime, the aroma of a shared winter was something fierce. No need to light candles, your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. Complaining wasn't an option because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals earned prime spots. This wasn't merely survival, it was a way of life, a ritual of family bonding. Those long, cold nights spent huddled together sparked storytelling, singing, and, no doubt, some very interesting whispered conversations beneath a shared woolen blanket. Medieval survival guides even recommended positioning the strongest, warmest family members on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep inside, treasured as the precious little heat generators they were. Sometimes even the bedding was communal, a shared straw mattress that flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly prioritized, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping setup. But when you're fighting frostbite, you stop being choosy. Body heat wasn't just comforting, it was tactical. And woe betide the restless soul who shifted too much during the night. One careless move to get comfortable, and suddenly Aunt Maud was cast into the freezing draught by the wall. Congratulations, you just earned the title of family villain. Children squeezed between parents, grandparents burrowed beneath the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel dropped by unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were fortunate, you scored the middle spot. Body heat radiating from every side. If not, you were stuck on the edge. The medieval version of sleeping next to the door of a walk-in freezer. Forget personal space. Privacy was non-existent. On the harshest nights, the goal wasn't comfort, it was simple. Don't wake up frozen stiff on the floor. Entire households crammed into the warmest corner of the hut, wrapped in whatever scraps of fabric they could scavenge, forming what could only be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Back in medieval times, the saying, "the more the merrier," wasn't about parties or fun, it was a cold-weather survival strategy. When the hearth sputtered and icy winds howled through every crevice, the most reliable source of heat was each other. If that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbours, farm animals, and perhaps a very bewildered goose, so be it. Ultimately, firebanking wasn't about conquering nature but buying a few precious extra hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even one glowing ember, that was a hard-won victory, enough to face another brutal day battling the relentless cold. Firebanking was a sacred skill passed down from parent to child like a treasured family recipe. Everyone had their own secrets. Some swore by using only dry ash, others insisted a touch of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight while others let them breathe. You could start a medieval family feud just by suggesting a better firebanking method. It was the ancient equivalent of debating barbecue techniques, only with much higher stakes: survival itself. Sometimes, no matter how carefully you banked the fire, a savage gust would sneak through a crack and extinguish it anyway. Or maybe a clumsy sheep would stumble straight into the hearth. Yes, it really happened. That's why some families took shifts, rising in the dead of night to monitor the dying embers, basically the medieval version of sleepwalking to check the thermostat. If done right, you could rise at dawn, gently poke the embers, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without frostbite. But if you botched it, well, mornings got a whole lot colder, and a whole lot grumpier. So peasants got clever. They mastered the art of firebanking, not a cozy savings account, but carefully burying the embers under a thick blanket of ash right before bed. This ash acted like insulation, cradling the glowing coals and keeping them barely alive until morning. And restarting a fire from scratch in the freezing dark, not just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Picture this: striking flint and steel with numb frozen fingers, half asleep, while a hungry wolf howled somewhere in the distance, reminding you exactly how desperate the situation was. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But, in the grip of a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was the fire going out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold crept in faster than a tax collector after harvest. Every family member had a job: stoking the flames, tending the embers, feeding the fire with twigs, sticks, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a relentless battle between human grit and the ruthless cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was simply impossible. Keeping that fire alive wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Letting it die out overnight was like hanging out a neon sign inviting the cold to waltz in and finish you off. Reigniting a fire in the dead of winter wasn't as simple as striking a match, because matches didn't exist yet. Instead, you had to wrestle with flint, steel, fragile kindling, and summon more prayers than you ever had before. No grand stone fireplace, no sweeping chimney channeling smoke skyward. Instead, there was a basic pit or a haphazard pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke billowing into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into a ham. That's right, most medieval homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke did its best, drifting out through tiny holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or simply settling in your lungs if it was feeling particularly lazy that night. Not ideal for breathing or for your lifespan, but on the bright side, it was surprisingly effective at fumigating fleas and other unwelcome house guests. Where needs pest control when you're practically marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just the source of warmth, it was the kitchen, the only light source, and sometimes the medieval equivalent of a television. Families gathered around the fire swapping stories, sharing gossip, or simply staring into the flickering flames because, honestly, after sunset, there wasn't much else to do. If medieval homes had a true winter hero, it wasn't the rickety roof or the walls plastered with mud and dung. It was the hearth. a crackling, stubborn fire pit that stood as the sole line of defense against the biting cold, the oppressive darkness, and the crushing gloom of medieval existence. At the heart of nearly every peasant's home was this humble fire. The harsh truth? Medieval peasants didn't so much conquer the icy ground beneath their feet as they grudgingly learned to exist uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about softness or dreams, it was about waking up with every toe still intact. And if you managed that, congratulations, you were doing better than most. Beds, for those lucky enough to have them, were hardly the sanctuary you'd hope for. Usually they were just simple wooden frames stuffed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Forget cozy mattresses, what you got were poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did almost nothing to block the relentless cold creeping up from the frozen earth below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep your blood flowing and stop one side of your body from turning into a block of ice. Medieval peasants fought this grim battle with whatever they could scavenge. Some laid thick mats of straw across the floor if you could afford it, or more likely, if you managed to borrow enough from your neighbour's field without getting caught. But straw flattened fast, moulded even faster, and added a crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Others layered dried rushes instead, tossing fresh ones on top without bothering to clean out the old. Over time, this created a bizarre ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet patting if your carpet was alive, damp, and smelled suspiciously like a wet dog. As if the biting air wasn't enough, there was a silent enemy creeping up from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors, they were just slightly flattened patches of earth inside your home. If you were lucky, someone had tossed down a handful of straw or old rushes to fake a bit of comfort, but make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted shove away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up through the earth like a sneaky little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your soul. Drop anything on the floor during a winter night? Congrats, it was now part of the permafrost. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from every direction, your body heat was under constant siege. But medieval peasants, whining wasn't in their vocabulary. Instead, they stuffed every crack with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled together like human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a generous smear of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because when your house was held together by mud and goat hair, at least you could laugh about it, sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard. To make matters worse, floors were usually nothing but compacted dirt. When rain or snow piled up outside, mud would seep right through the ground. So, technically they had indoor water features, not that anyone was thrilled about it. Come winter, every step inside your own home felt like slogging across a frozen marsh. Cold, seeping through your boots and settling into your bones. And if they existed at all, they were laughably tiny, usually nothing more than a hole covered with thin animal hide or a clumsy wooden shutter. Glass was so rare and expensive that even the lord of the manor might only have one tiny pane. As for peasants, they were just grateful if the wind didn't tear the cowhide right off the wall in the middle of a blizzard. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not even close. But character building? Oh, without a doubt. And then there were the roofs. Those quaint, thatched roofs might look like something out of a storybook, but after a few months of relentless rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and sometimes even invited in the local wildlife. Nothing quite says charming evening like a squirrel crashing your dinner party right on your plate. Dung was the ultimate budget-friendly sticky insulator. Always on hand, let's just say that. But, no matter how carefully these walls were smeared, they didn't stand a chance against a real winter storm. The cold wind hunted down every crack and crevice, sneaking and swirling its way through those one-room huts, making sure you never, ever got comfortable. Their homes weren't just drafty, They were full-on, wildly enthusiastic wind tunnels topped with a roof. Imagine sticks tangled like a giant, shaky basket slathered with a rather unappetizing mix of mud, straw, and animal dung. Don't wrinkle your nose, they weren't trying to be gross, just getting creative with whatever nature threw their way. It's the kind of construction that makes you wonder how anyone survived the first sneeze. It was about gritting your teeth, layering every rag and scrap of cloth you owned, curling up as close as possible to your livestock, because let's be honest, their body heat was your best hope, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles dangling from your eyebrows. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the real adventure was only beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window won't shut all the way, trust me, medieval peasants would have some strong opinions to share. Frostbite, hypothermia, plain old freezing to death. These weren't rare tragedies. They were regular visitors, especially if you were very young, very old, or just very unlucky. Every morning you woke up, still breathing, was a small, private miracle. Honestly, it deserved a celebration. Maybe a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast if you were feeling fancy. Because surviving a medieval winter had nothing to do with comfort. It was about endurance, grit, and the stubborn refusal to let the cold claim you in your sleep. Ah yes, luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. But the cold wasn't just a nuisance. It wasn't something you complained about on the way to the market. It was a real creeping danger. The kind that didn't knock. It just slipped in, quiet and patient, and waited for you to stop moving. Spoiler alert, layering like a human onion, yeah, it didn't really work. And you can forget about snuggling under fluffy quilts like in the storybooks. Beds, if you could even call them that, were usually just lumpy sacks stuffed with straw, or maybe some old rushes that had seen better centuries. As a bonus, you'd get a few freeloading fleas to keep you company, because nothing says restful sleep like scratching yourself into a new religion. If you happen to be sitting on the far side of the room, well, sorry, you might as well have pitched a tent outside, only with worse snacks and zero bragging rights. And clothing? Useless. Peasants didn't exactly strut around in fur-lined coats or curl up in goose-down blankets. No, you had maybe 2 rough-spun wool tunics that scratched like they held a personal grudge. If you were lucky, there was a cloak that smelled vaguely and persistently of goat. Your best defense against the cold was layering until you resembled a disgruntled human onion, and praying that frostbite wasn't feeling ambitious that night. Inside your home, the temperature wasn't so much warm as it was slightly less cruel than the weather outside. If it was freezing out there, it was politely just above freezing in here, as if your hut was trying to comfort you with a weak smile and a pat on the back. Nights, they were the real test. Darkness didn't just fall, it devoured everything. You couldn't see your own hand unless it was on fire. The wind screamed through every gap and crack like a furious ghost, demanding to be let in. And the hearth? It coughed out a few dying embers, barely enough to warm the toes of whoever had staked out the prime spot closest to the flame. It tried, poor thing, but mostly it just flickered and failed, like it knew the cold had already won. It came every year, a brutal ritual of survival, like some merciless teacher who never gave out second chances. Now, imagine this. You're huddled inside a cramped hut, barely held together by mud and sticks. The kind of place where the walls are so thin you'd swear you could hear a bird sneeze 3 trees away. There's no insulation, no real windows, just a fist-sized hole crudely plugged with animal hide. And forget about thermostat arguments with your siblings. The only temperature setting here is whatever nature decides that day. Cold bites through the cracks like tiny teeth. Heat settles in like a curse. And yet, this is home.